think there are a few more popping into the waiting room. We're just giving it a minute, everybody who's joining us now before we start, just to make sure we can load everyone in. There's actually quite a lot of participants already in the meeting. We're at 51 and there's many more people in the waiting room. So we're just gonna let everybody load in, lock in to the virtual reality that we find ourselves in. And Stephen, are you able to do you want to keep admitting people as they arrive, or?
Yep, everybody else will just skip right into the meeting.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that there's probably a tremendous amount of Zoom burnout these days for everybody, but it's so wonderful that you could be here and talk about this important issue. So I am Sujata Gibson. I am a candidate for the New York State Assembly in the 125th District here in Tompkins and Cortland counties in New York. And I'm not here for politics, I'm here for education. So I believe that, you know, one of my responsibilities as a politician is to use this platform to have community conversations about issues that are important and, you know, help grow our kind of collective conversation on issues. And particularly right now, as we find ourselves in this crisis and real breakdown of everything that many things we've known, we have an opportunity, at least, though at times are hard, to start imagining what kind of future we want to build. Where do we want to go from here? So I've started this forum series called The Green New Dream, where each week we explore, or you know, maybe more than one topic about the future. And one of the important things that keeps coming up is a sort of plan that seems to be in the works for some people's reimagination of New York, to create a very high-tech dystopian future. You know, we have tech billionaires coming in, being put on task force by the governor, and many people. Zephyr Teachout has written about this. Naomi Klein has talked about that kind of future, and I think it's a good opportunity right now to talk about what kind of future we really want. And one aspect of that is during this pause, when we're all, you know, thinking about basic survival, somehow 5G has become a huge priority and is being rolled out across the state. And so we don't have time to think about it. It's being introduced here in Ithaca very shortly. The Ithaca Common Council just decided to vote to accept a contract with Verizon. There is a slight possibility of getting out of it because they have said they won't be signed until the design plans are approved, but there was no discussion. And I think, you know, these are difficult times, so that was unfortunate, but we have an opportunity right now to try to have that discussion. So please stay muted. We're gonna go for about an hour and a half. Please put your comments and questions in the chat and we will get to them. But first, let me introduce our panelists. So we have with us today, Professor David O. Carpenter, who is a Harvard-trained public health physician and scientist. He is currently a professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Al-Madini SUNY, where he is the director of the Institute for Health and the Environment, a collaborating center of the World Health Organization. Dr. Carpenter is the co-editor-in-chief of the academic journal Reviews on Environmental Health and co-editor-in-chief of the journal Environmental Pollution. In addition, Dr. Carpenter has authored more than, I believe it's 400 something peer-reviewed publications and 6 books. His research has included studies on adverse effects of hydraulic fracturing, fracking, farmed salmon, and electromagnetic fields. And he has said that up to 15% of cases of childhood cancer might be caused by exposure to magnetic fields from power lines. We're very grateful for his lifelong dedication to public health. I certainly, you know, in the fracking fight, was very impressed with his work and very grateful for his work, and I'm grateful to hear what he has to say here. Dr. Paul Héroux is also joining us from Canada. Dr. Héroux is a scientist with experience in physics. He has a BSc, an MSc, and a PhD. He also has experience in engineering, over 15 years, and health sciences, over 30 years. His area of expertise is the health effects of electromagnetism, toxicology, and hearing conservation. He began his career working for industry, and then after that ended up becoming a professor and now teaches and writes at McGill University, where he is currently the Occupational Health Program Director and also a medical scientist in the Department of Surgery at the McGill University Health Center. Dr. Hérault, as all our panelists have, has testified all over the world and is recognized as an expert on this issue. And last but not least, we have attorney Daphna Takover, Esquire, a leading 5G expert. She works with Children's Health Defense currently. She's an attorney with an MBA and has a technology background from her service as a telecommunications and computers officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, where she served as the commander of the Computer Center of the Operations Center and Headquarters. In 2009, attorney Takover developed microwave sickness and became an activist after that point, and has been involved in lawsuits and movements all over the world. She brought a Supreme Court case in Israel to replace the use of Wi-Fi with wired networks. She founded an advocacy group called We Are the Evidence. She's been in documentaries, she's testified before governmental bodies, and she has been involved in a number of the lawsuits that towns and localities and countries are having today. Just quickly before I turn it over to my panel for a little bit of background, this is an issue that is kind of getting traction worldwide and really has been for quite a while. The Nation ran an excellent article that we can put in the chat later a few years ago about how the big wireless has sort of tried to suppress and whitewash the science just as big oil and big tobacco have, but that there are a number of concerns that at this point are so overwhelming that whole countries are putting moratoriums on 5G. And this is a very relevant conversation for today. So I'm going to turn it over to my panel and ask you to talk a little bit about what got you, what kind of field of study you have within the 4G, 5G small cell technology, and what brought you, what your interest is, and what your kind of evolution to get there was. Dr. Carpenter, would you like to
Well,
start?
let me start then.
Okay.
I think to talk about 5G, we have to start by talking about 3G and 4G, because the real evidence that we have for hazard comes from studies of 3G and 4G. 5G hasn't been around long enough for us to have information from human exposure. We have an enormous amount of information on excessive exposure to 3G and 4G and what the impacts are on human health. The strongest evidence, in my judgment, is the evidence that people that use a cell phone held to their head without a wired earpiece for long periods of time they have an increased risk of gliomas, and especially glioblastoma, the very dangerous brain cancer that John McCain died of, Ted Kennedy died of, Joe Biden died of, Johnny Cochran died of. Now, we don't know that these people used their cell phone held to their head, but given their public role, I wouldn't be a bit surprised they did. We know that in studies mainly from Scandinavia, but some from other parts of the world, that people that have used cell phones held to their head intensively for 10 years or more have somewhere between a 2 and 4% elevation in risk of developing those brain cancers. Now, that information has been around for quite a while, but it's been pretty much ignored. And one of the excuses that people have ignored it was a statement that nobody's ever demonstrated these cancers in animals. Well, in the last 2 years, that's changed totally. The National Toxicology Program out of the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences exposed rats to cell phone intensity radiation over their lifespan. They demonstrated the same 2 cancers that we see in people in those rats. Now, I mentioned the gliomas, but the other cancer that we see in people is an acoustic neuroma, which is actually a tumor of the auditory nerve, which of course is directly exposed if you're holding your cell phone to your head. Now, in addition, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy performed a study not of cell phone intensity, but cell tower intensities. which is a fraction of the intensity that you get from holding a cell phone to your head. And they demonstrated the same two cancers. Notably, the National Toxicology Program demonstrated increase in DNA damage. So DNA damage is the general mechanism whereby cancer is formed. So I think this is clear from 3 and 4G. As I said, we haven't studied 5G. Now, there are other health effects as well. There is clear documentation of reduction in male fertility. I often say that if you hold a wireless laptop on your lap for a while and you're a male, you probably don't have to use a condom for several weeks because the sperm are cooked. And these are at intensities, I shouldn't have used the word cook because these are non-thermal intensities, but they're intensities that cause damage, that generate reactive oxygen species, which we think is the mechanism behind all of these effects.
So
There are
let me
effects
stop
on
you
learning
there.
and memory.
Let me stop you there just so that for the people like me who have a very basic understanding of this, can you, I do want to ask all about the science, but could you just tell us, what is 5G as opposed to 3G and 4G?
Evie, do you mind if I was actually exactly thinking about it. Maybe I think it might be a good idea to take 2 minutes to explain the terms to people. When we say thermal, when we say microwave, when we say all of those things. So maybe I should make a short presentation about that. Would that be, so everyone will understand the words we're using and the concept. So
Perfect.
I'm going to, let me do that. I was just thinking about it as we talked. I'm going to upload, can you release the share screen? It says that the host disable participant screen sharing. I want to put
Stephen, can you do that?
electromagnetic spectrum.
Stephen, are you able to do that?
Yep, she's co-host now.
Okay.
I'm going to use the, sorry, just a second. I'll put this one on and now I'm going to go this, share screen. Okay, so let's see, share.
I don't see it yet. Oh, not
Let's
yet.
take a second. You
It's
see it
coming.
now?
It looks like it's on its way. Yes, it's up for me anyway.
Okay, so so this is really crucial because there's so many words, and I think that for people to understand what we're talking about, they have to understand the basics. So I want to go through the basic a little bit. So when we talk about wireless, essentially we're talking about information that is going on the air. So when we see the sun, when we talk on the phone, when we use wireless, we basically use electromagnetic frequencies that are going on the air. We don't see them, but they are there. And the difference between the frequency of the sun to the frequency of the phone to the frequency of radio is how many oscillations per second that wave has. And the unit we use for that is hertz. So a frequency or a wave of 1 hertz means 1 oscillation per second. 60 hertz is 60 oscillation per second, and that's what the frequency used for house electricity. In comparison, Wi-Fi uses a frequency of 2,450,000,000 oscillations per second. So if the house electricity is a very low frequency, Wi-Fi is a very high frequency. And the collection of all of these frequencies is what is known as the electromagnetic spectrum, which is what you see now on the screen. And we divide it to different groups of frequencies because each group has a little bit different characteristics than the other groups. So if we look on that image here, in green you see extremely low frequencies. That's where the house electricity is. Then very low frequencies. Then in yellow, you see radio waves, and then in orange, microwaves. Those are the 2 groups of frequencies we use for wireless technology. And then you see other groups of frequencies. Now, we also divide that electromagnetic spectrum into 2 main groups. If you see on the bottom, there is this blue line, and that basically, all the frequencies on the right are considered to be ionizing frequencies that emit ionizing radiation. And the frequencies on the left are non-ionizing frequencies that emit non-ionizing radiation. What does it mean? Ionizing frequencies mean that they are the higher frequencies, and therefore they have they're higher frequency, they have more energy, and they have enough energy to pull an electron out of the atom when they interact with our body. And that process is called ionization. And that's why we call them ionizing frequencies. For example, X-rays. And we know that X-rays are harmful because they have the ability to have an immediate impact on our body when they interact with our body. Now, on the left, we see the non-ionizing frequencies. And because they are lower frequencies, they have less energy, and they do not have enough energy to pull an electron out of the atom when they interact with our body. And so they are called non-ionizing frequencies, and they emit non-ionizing radiation. Now, because they do not have the ability to create ionization in our body, the assumption is or was that therefore they're not harmful unless they're being transmitted with such power, with such intensity, that they create a change in temperature in our tissue, in our body. And that is called the thermal effect. So the reason wireless technology is considered to be safe is because it's using radio waves or radio frequencies and microwave frequencies, which mean they're non-ionizing frequencies. And since allegedly they do not emit levels of radiation which create thermal impact, allegedly they're not harmful. However, what Dr. Carpenter did not mention is that the most important report on this issue is a bioinitiative report. It's a report that he co-authored with other 28 experts on this issue, and it includes thousands of studies, including about, I guess, over 1,000 studies on the issue of wireless that show clearly that there are harms associated with non-thermal levels of this radiation. And so the big conflict here, the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, which regulate this issue, and the industry claim that there are no non-thermal effects. And those on our side claim there are thousands of studies showing beyond any doubt that there are non-thermal effects. And this is kind of like the issue in nutshells.
So as far as I understand it, the old understanding, and I think this was back in the 80s or 90s, right, was that as long as this technology, at that point we're talking about, 2G, 3G, whatever it is, I'm not sure, as long as it's not hot, we won't be harmed by it.
Unless it burns you, yeah. So it goes beyond that. So what I did not mention, maybe I should go back, is basically 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, all of the G stands for generation. So all of this technology were about connecting people. 5G, it's not only about connecting people, it's more about connecting things. It's the infrastructure for the Internet of Things and anything and everything that will come forward. So it means that now not only we talk to people on the phone, our things start to communicate with our phones as well. Our laundry machine, our TV, our tea kettle, even our baby diapers have antennas to text the mother when a baby poops. So that's what 5G is about. Now, in terms of health effect, what's the difference between 5G and 4G? So all of those technologies are essentially using frequencies which are in the microwave spectrum. So the microwave spectrum goes from, it goes up to about 300 gigahertz. And so while, for example, right now we're using frequencies which are up to more or less 6 gigahertz, means 6 billion hertz per second, 5G is also going to use higher frequencies. They're still within the microwave bandwidth, but they're a bit higher. They're going to use frequencies which are called millimeter waves. They're still microwave frequencies, just higher, between 20 to 90 gigahertz. And the thing is, the higher the frequency is, the less penetration it has. So the industry actually claims that in a way it's less harmful because it doesn't penetrate as deep as the other microwave frequencies. And I would let our scientists, if they want to go into the science, say why is that not true? But
let's stop there and ask that. Yeah. So we've gotten, just to recap, we've gotten the older science, when the FCC passed their regulations, said, we think it's probably perfectly safe as long as it doesn't burn you or get really hot. Microwave technology, cellular radiation, what have you. But then the science started to be developed, and as you said, over 1,000 studies, perhaps more, have shown that there are harmful effects at a much lower level before it gets hot at all. And so the issue now is this old outdated science or what? So I'd love to hear about, kind of both that and then, but why don't we start with the science, this claim that the higher frequency might not penetrate the skin, so it might not have the same effects as the, let me just make sure I'm recapping it right. So that beyond that argument, I think that argument has maybe been won, and I'll let the scientists talk about that. But now industry is saying, well, even if the lower frequency, not hot stuff is still dangerous, it's not going to be dangerous with 5G because it's a higher frequency and that can't penetrate the skin. Is that the argument now?
Correct.
Okay, so can you tell us why that is or is not accurate and what we know about it? Dr. Carpenter, I cut you off, so if you want to continue there.
Well, I was going on to the health effects. I think this would be a good time for Paul to step in and talk about the more physics of the radiation.
Okay, Dr. Hiro.
Well, when I, so to speak, jumped into this world of electromagnetic health effects, people like David were already veterans in this business. But what I could see is that there was an apparent discussion as to what the limits should be. And so I thought it's extremely difficult to recognize the truth from lies, essentially, in this area. So I thought, I'm going to run experiments for myself. And so having very small budgets, all I could do was run experiments on cells. But when I ran experiments on cells that were done very, very, very carefully, I realized that there should not have been any discussion whatsoever. The effects of non-ionizing radiation, when it's non-ionizing and in amounts that are minuscule by the standards of the FCC, have drastic effects on biological systems. And as far as I can see, the retaining of heat as a criterion to determine harm by the FCC was nothing but a extremely thinly veiled method of achieving extremely high standards so that they could deploy anything they wanted. In my opinion, the science was never confused, was never in doubt, but it took Carpenter a lot of courage to, I would say, splinter away from all this discussion and create the Bioinitiative Group when he realized that the whole arena had been hijacked by industry and would never come to a rational scientific conclusion. So each time I hear that there's a scientific discussion, I really become very uncomfortable because science resolves these questions very quickly in the combination of cell studies, epidemiological studies, animal studies, and Dr. Carpenter very generously forgets the CHU study, 1992, released very late by the US Air Force because it was very embarrassing, 4 times increase in cancers. So we have lived with this lie for a very, very long time. And it's time now to stop.
And by the way, this is what we're doing. Actually, the Children's Health Defense submitted a case against the FCC on February 2nd, 2020, challenging the FCC decision not to review its health and safety guidelines. So since 1996, the FCC did not review its guidelines. And these guidelines were obsolete already when adopted, as both Carpenter and Paul LaRue mentioned. They are based on thermal effects, although we have thousands of studies showing non-thermal effects. And because we decided not to review the guidelines, we submitted that lawsuit. And actually, Dr. Carpenter is one of the petitioners in our case. The Children's Health Defense is a petitioner in our case. I saw one of the participants here in this conversation is Virginia Farver, who is also a petitioner in our case. And there's another group that submitted a case as well. And actually on July 1st, we're supposed to submit our brief. So that's why I'm a bit tired. We've been writing a lot.
Well, thank you for that work. And so going back, I'm going to ask a question from the chat. And this is something that I've noticed really changing quite a bit just in the kind of layman's popular press discussion about wireless harms and technology. Back in 2018, as I said, the nation ran a pretty thorough investigative report about the kind of industry whitewashing, the thousands of studies that had emerged, the many, World Health Organization, which you run a partner center, or you're a collaborating center with, Dr. Carpenter, how they had recognized these health impacts. And so it's fairly well established that there is a real concern here, and many, many scientists share it. But then recently, in the last year, I've seen all these kind of blogs and quick pieces in the New York Times and other places, and our reader has shared one, kind of alleging it's just an outlier. Maybe there's this one he's sharing is, there was this guy named Dr. Curry, he had a flawed theory, and then Dr. Carpenter also did. So how the question here, and I will just read it as the question is, how do you respond to accusations that your research is rejected by mainstream scientists and that some of your data has been unable to be replicated?
Well, I'd like to respond to that because I've recently published a report going back to what I got first involved with, which was this issue about magnetic fields from power lines and household electricity causing childhood leukemia. Those studies were done back in the 90s. And in the year 2000, there were 4 meta-analyses. These were reports where investigators took all the data up to that point, analyzed them for quality, and all concluded that elevated magnetic fields cause childhood leukemia. Well, since then, there have been about 20 reports, and I reviewed those 20 reports. 7 of them found statistically significant, these were new studies now, statistically significant associations between magnetic field exposure and childhood leukemia. All of them were supported by government agencies or foundations. Another 8 found elevations in risk, but they weren't quite statistically significant. All of them supported by government agencies or foundations. There were 7 supported by the utilities. All of them failed to find any association whatsoever. And then the public gets this message that the results are inconsistent and incomplete, which is absolute nonsense if you look at who funded the studies. We have a powerful industry that doesn't want their product to be accepted as being potentially dangerous. And this industry controls the FCC. The FCC has no health expertise. They admit that. The directors of the FCC have always come from the telecommunications industry. So the problem is this conflict of interest between the scientists that don't have a financial interest in this, but try to get at the real information, and the industry that will fund scientists of questionable repute to find that there is not a significant association, which then feeds the press, which makes this claim that the results are not consistent and are inconclusive. That's not true.
I think in the context of the article you just quoted, that was a New York Times article. We have another big problem, which is right now the telecom companies not only control the media through advertisement, unfortunately, they actually literally control the media and own it. So AT&T owns Times Warner and CNN. Verizon owns AOL and Yahoo. The New York Times is owned by Carlos Slim, one of the world's richest people and a telecom entrepreneur. Comcast owns NBC, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no chance we're going to get any real news. It's actually fake news that we're seeing in our media nowadays. And I'm not even going into the social media where Zuckerberg is invested in 5G. Google is heavily invested in 5G, AI, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't get the real news on this issue. And that's why people need to go and look, search activists and people like Professor Carpenter and Professor Heroux and go to the Bioinitiative and read the science and make up their own mind. The telecom industry is literally controlling government agencies, regulatory agencies, the WHO, So it's no surprise that we hear that there's no evidence. There is ample evidence, just like it was with tobacco, just like it was with asbestos. Everything else is fraud and manufactured science and creation of doubt in the public.
Yeah, I mean, it's really to a shocking degree. I was pretty involved with the fight against fracking, and I remember the days when everybody said, well, the EPA says the science is settled, it's completely safe, 100 peer-reviewed studies show it. And Dr. Carpenter, I know that you were one of many scientists who was able to kind of break through that. Are there parallels that you are seeing between this fight and the fracking fight at all?
Well, I wish there were parallels. It was very interesting when Health Commissioner Zucker made the announcement that the governor had banned fracking in New York. He waived my paper, which was, I think, the best impact I've had on public policy, because we had looked at fracking sites in 5 states and found that there were momentary releases of chemicals, including carcinogens, some 10,000 times greater than EPA standards for exposure. Now, the EPA standards were averaged over long periods of time, whereas our samples were taken quickly. The problem is that nobody has stepped forward with that kind of information on this issue of health effects of 3G, 4G, and also 5G. Now, let me make one other point. We talk about non-ionizing and ionizing radiation, but in fact, one of the mechanisms that's been well documented for these, quote, non-ionizing effects is that they cause generation of reactive oxygen species. Most people know those as free radicals. Well, these are harm to water molecules, but those ionizations of the water molecules cause ionizations of DNA. That's how the National Toxicology Program demonstrated DNA damage from, quotes, non-ionizing radiation.
So, Dr. Hérault, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well, this kind of push to discount the thousands of studies that anybody can really find. And you know, the well-documented, even the World Health Organization will say that New York Times article is not accurate. It's not just you and one scientist from the 60s or 70s, or, you know, that there are many hundreds of scientists who have published on this. So Dr. Hérault, you actually worked for the telecommunications industry before becoming a professor at McGill. Am I getting that right?
Yes, I worked for a power utility, and I was hired as a consultant by Nortel and Siemens. And the problem here is that even at the World Health Organization, you have an electrical engineer presiding over the committee that determines health limits. And this is what has happened almost everywhere. When I was working for a power utility, we would be told that if we don't go to these meetings, although we know little about it, we're not going to have any influence. I was part of IEEE Committee SC3 and SC4. I know what happened there. Essentially, you had engineers who were essentially guarding the review of the literature very, very carefully to make sure that only the good stuff went in. It was manipulated extremely carefully. Why? Because it was critical to industry to evade responsibility or scrutiny by true health people like Dr. Carpenter. The main arguments that industry used to promote the science that actually supposedly demonstrated innocuousness was, first, it's non-ionizing. Well, as my colleague in New Hampshire, Dr. Wood says, this is totally immaterial because the whole body is already ionized. So it has nothing to do with having an effect or not. The second argument is that these fields are much too small. But in fact, the sensitivity, if you want to think in terms of energy of the human body, is 1,000 times more sensitive than the lowest observed effect in the bioinitiatives report. In other words, you can hear me. That means that you're sensitive to 1 picowatt per square meter. So what the FCC is telling you, that the energy is too small, in these observations of non-thermal effects is entirely ridiculous. But they were able to push that because they dominated the committees and the procedures. And here again, we are exactly in the situation where they have infiltrated the FCC is, of course, by definition, a spectrum allocating agency, but they have infiltrated the World Health Organization and are continuing to do so.
And I think that that's bring us back to, you know, the question whether or not 5G is more harmful or less harmful. So, you know, there's I recommend people to watch a presentation by Dr. Dart. It's online on YouTube. And he said there's some sentence that I really liked. He said, you know, saying that there are no effects except for thermal effects is maybe good physics, but it's bad biology. There are numerous other effects that can happen from this technology that have nothing to do with thermal effects. Furthermore, wireless is not only about energy, how much energy is emitted. In order to put data, in order to put that phone call or to put that video that you download in over those wireless frequencies, RF frequencies or micro frequency, you have to do something which is called pulsation and modulation, which is how you put the data on the signal. And that was found to be the most bioactive element of this technology, the element that is likely causing most of the harm. So it's not about the energy, it's about the signals, the pulsation, modulation of the signal that's causing a lot of the effects. And that element of it is completely disregarded by the current standards because industry know that that's where the problem is. And actually there's a paper showing that most of the paper, whilst some of the papers that use only the carrier wave, only the wireless wave, show effects. Almost all the studies that actually use the modulation, the way the actually data being transferred, causing adverse effects. So this is another element. So when it comes to 5G, yes, maybe it doesn't penetrate the wave, the higher frequency maybe not penetrate as deeply into the skin. However, first, the skin is the biggest organ in the body and there are nerves all over the skin and they connect from the skin to any organ in our body. So clearly there will be effect as well. Furthermore, it seems that the modulation of the 5G for what we know are actually more complex and therefore there is higher chance that they'll be even more harmful than the current technologies. In addition to that, people need to know that 5G is not only a technology, it's an infrastructure. So anything and everything that has to do with existing infrastructure is also part of the 5G infrastructure. And in fact, most of the antennas that right now are being used for 5G infrastructure are actually 4G antennas. And we already know that we have numerous studies that's showing effect from 4G, 3G, etc. So 5G is an infrastructure more than an actual technology. And we know that that infrastructure is harmful.
Let me elaborate on that a little bit because this is a very important point. There are these mini cell towers being put up in front of about every 6 or 8 house in every urban street in the whole world. And this is because the 5G doesn't penetrate very far. It's blocked by weather, it's blocked by leaves. It doesn't penetrate glass, it doesn't penetrate brick or wood. But we still have the 3 and 4G technology. So these little mini cell towers everywhere are not going to just emit 5G, and we need to discuss more hazards of 5G, but they're also going to generate 3G and 4G. And that means that everybody walking down the sidewalk is going to be exposed to a much greater level of 3G and 4G radiation than they would be exposed to from a cell tower on a hill that's, 2 miles away. This is my biggest concern. I mean, we need to study hazards of 5G. There's almost no information that, because there's been no study or very little study, certainly no study in humans. But we know that 3G and 4G are harmful, and we know that the implementation of 5G is going to increase the exposure to 3 and 4G. And that is very, very dangerous.
And I think that's another argument. So Israel, the industry is using a lot of misinformation. So they're saying, oh, those small cells, they're small, they emit much less radiation than those big towers. But it's important to understand that those big towers may emit more radiation, but radiation drops in a square of the distance. So even if they have more radiation, by the time the radiation gets to our streets from those big towers, it's actually much lower than the radiation emitted by those small cells. And in fact, we measure when we measure the radiation in the streets where small cell 5G antennas have been installed. We measure levels of radiation which are thousands of times higher than what they used to be before the installation of this antenna. So they may be smaller, but because of the close proximity, the levels of radiation are much higher. And sadly, I'm in touch with numerous families that have been injured, not years after those antennas have been installed near their homes, not months, literally days after the installation of those small cell antennas, whole families are becoming sick. The most interesting story I got someone recently commented on my Facebook page. He actually used to work for the wireless industry, signing contracts for cell towers for the wireless industry. And then they put a small cell antenna behind his house. Both him and his wife are sick, and now they had to leave their home.
Can you talk more about what some of these injuries that you've seen have been, and what the kind of science to support that it is an injury from wireless injury?
I think that the most widespread manifestation of the harms of wireless technology is a condition I suffer from, which is called microwave sickness, or also known, but I don't think that's the right name, electrosensitivity. I'm not sensitive to electricity, and I'm not sensitive. I got injured from this technology. And the rates, we don't have any current data as to how many people are being affected by it, but we know that humans are electric beings. So this is affecting us whether or not we already subjectively can perceive those effects. Surveys that were done up to 2006, 2005 showed at that time, 10% of the population had symptoms. And that is before Wi-Fi, that is before smartphones, that is before smart meters. So very, very likely the rates are much higher. And this is also what those of us who work on the ground on this issue definitely can say that, you know, I get every day more and more calls and people complain. So anyone who has symptoms like tingling in the hands when they use the cell phone, pain in the head, this is basically what microwave sickness or electrosensitivity is. Essentially, when you get symptoms from exposure to this radiation, that means that you got affected by this technology. Other symptoms would be headaches, heart palpitations, sleep disturbances. A lot of people suffer auditory effects. Nosebleeds are very big with children, noise sensitivity, pain in the eyes, and other visual problems with the eyes. For some people, it's being nauseous, muscle problems, flu-like symptoms that don't go away. So essentially neurological effects. And they're quite common. And many times people are being misdiagnosed. We see children that are being misdiagnosed, for example, with ADHD, where in fact they are affected by this radiation. And when the families remove the wireless devices from their homes, these children are becoming fine and the ADHD diagnosis is being removed. So when you and or your children start to have all kind of cognitive problems, headaches, sleep problems, et cetera, you may want to consider that it's your wireless devices that are causing those symptoms. And the evidence is massive, by the way. That was the other part. So actually, we started researching the issue of whether or not microwave frequencies and technologies can cause harm when our soldiers in the military, when our soldiers in the Navy and the Air Force started to complain about symptoms when they used radars, because radars, just like cell phones or Wi-Fi, use microwave frequencies in non-thermal levels. And they became sick, and that's when we started calling this condition microwave sickness. So we already know from the 50s and 60s and 70s that there is such a condition. But at the time, it was only, you know, army or military personnel that were getting it because they were the only one who were exposed to this level of radiations. But since we commercialized wireless technology in the 80s, the levels of radiation in the population increased significantly, and now the whole population is being exposed to the same levels as those military persons, and that's why we now see the sickness in the population.
Dr. Hérault and Dr. Carpenter, would you like to weigh in on some of the science that what does the science say about these injuries and the possibility of them being from 5G?
Well, 5G, as Dr. Carpenter mentioned, we don't have a lot of information because we don't have any human exposure of substance. And then it takes 10 years to sort all of this thing out. But we have experience from the previous generations that were claimed to be harmless. There was a study conducted in Brazil, in one of the largest cities in Brazil, by the public health officials and all the universities in that town. And they determined that if you live within 500 meters of a cell phone tower, your probability of dying from a cancer that you already have is significantly higher. In other words, we're not even talking about the tower giving you cancer, which is supported by the Ramazzini Institute study. We're talking about you have cancer from some cause. So we've inventoried these cases, we've classified them. Then we assess, are these people going to die after they have installed a tower near their home? And if it's within 500 meters that you live, your chance of dying from your cancer is higher. In fact, if you live very near the tower, it's as much as 45% higher that you're going to die of your cancer. So this is a lethal health impact. So when they come to you and they say, we're going to put these towers all around you, I would revolt.
So when you say, so that seems really high to me, but as a non-scientist, is that kind of percentage difference between those who are and are not within 500 meters something? Is that super high? Basically, 40% seems,
What you have to understand, a study of that kind is, I would say, more immune to artifacts because you're taking people who have cancers, and then the public health institutions follow them, and the telcos in Brazil cooperated in getting detailed information of when these supplementary cell phone towers were installed. And lo and behold, you can find a connection between the installation of a cell phone tower and your probability of dying of your cancer. Now, how industry can manage to sweep these things under the carpet repeatedly can only be explained by powerful interests that are at work.
The problem is nowadays we cannot conduct any more studies on cell towers because we have such saturation of cell towers anywhere and everywhere, and we're exposed to so much radiation from Wi-Fi systems, so we cannot anymore learn about do epidemiological studies, and that's a big problem. So we have all of this massive body of studies that we've been ignoring, and it's time to look back at them and see there's a lot of evidence, massive amounts of evidence of every and any type.
Dr. Carpenter, would you like to weigh in on some more of the what the science shows about the health impacts of these previous generations?
Well, I think the evidence is just overwhelming. It isn't that there have been no studies. There have been an enormous number of studies, but you have the people from the physics and engineering communities who have this mistaken hypothesis that there cannot be any health effects unless it's caused by elevations in temperature. And so they discard all of this information. And unfortunately, these are the people that dominate organizations that set standards like the FCC, like the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. They influence the health agencies like the World Health Organization. I work closely with the World Health Organization. I and a number of European colleagues went to visit them in Geneva 2 years ago to beg that they look at the information. We got nowhere with them. It's really a problem where it isn't that we need more research. We need people to critically look at the research that we have to address the issue of conflicts of interest that result in people just ignoring information that we have. Let me go change a little bit and talk about this electrohypersensitivity. Some older people may remember that in the days of the Cold War, the Russians irradiated the US Embassy in Moscow with microwaves. Everybody got very upset because the standards in the Soviet Union for exposure to radio frequency radiation were much more stringent than we had in the US. The US Congress ordered studies on cancer in the people that worked in the embassy. And of course, they didn't find any elevations in cancer because cancer takes a long latency. But a great percentage of the people working in the embassy couldn't sleep at night. They had constant headaches. They had GI and cardiovascular upset. This is all of the syndrome of microwave illness, but it was ascribed to just being anxiety. Now, not everybody, fortunately, I don't experience this microwave illness personally, or at least not at a level that I'm aware of, unlike Daphne and many other people that do. And I've talked with enough people to know that people can be totally incapacitated if they're electrosensitive, if they're sensitive to this thing. The way most people can understand it best, it's like being an allergy. I mean, it's not an allergy, but it's like being allergic to poison ivy. Some people can touch it, you don't get anything. Other people get near it, and you have horrible effects. And this is really something that's going to increase dramatically as we increase the exposure of everybody.
It's already very widespread, so.
I'd like to make a point in terms of the physics and the engineers. In a sense, I imagine you can excuse the engineers because they are, after all, promoting a product. It is their profession. Physics is entirely compatible with all the health effects that Dr. Carpenter can put into his bag. If you take a physicist who has never, looked at biology, he may very quickly conclude that, on the basis of non-ionizing and too small, I can't see how. But physics, well done, will support the health effects of electromagnetic radiation to a T. So there is no incompatibility between physics and biology in this way. The incompatibility is between management of engineers and science.
By the way, Dr. Carpenter mentioned the events in the embassy in Moscow, but there's a paper that was published in 2018 by Professor Beatrice Gollum from UCSD about the sickness, the mystery sickness of the diplomats in Cuba and in China. And she actually showed quite conclusively that the symptoms they've been experiencing are actually microwave sickness. And our government did admit that indeed, it's very likely that that is the explanation. And there was a 60 Minutes program that followed her paper where the RF expert in the embassy, who is one of those who've been affected, also said that this is likely what's causing their symptoms. So there was no thermal effect. So clearly they've been exposed to microwave weapon, which was not a thermal based weapon, but one which is in non-thermal level, just like the wireless technology we're using now on 5G antennas we're putting everywhere. And maybe the reason more of them became sick is because they use modulations that can be more harmful than the normal modulation. But the bottom line is our population is now getting sick from these antennas, from the Wi-Fi, from the cell phone, just like those diplomats with a condition called microwave sickness. So if the government admitted it in regard to the diplomat, how can they deny the harm to the whole population from this technology? It's exactly the same kind of technology.
And at this point, even the World Health Organization does say that it's a possible carcinogen, right?
Yeah, so the WHO has two, so there's, within the WHO, there's the EMF project, which is what was mentioned before as a project that is run by an engineer, which is completely controlled by industry and there's no effects. While another group in the WHO, which is IARC, which is the department that is responsible to regulate, to classify carcinogen.
International Agency for Research on Cancer.
And they in 2011 decided to classify RF radiation as a to-be carcinogen, as a possible carcinogen. Maybe Carpenter, maybe you want to talk about it in regards to the NTP?
Well,
yeah.
A lot of the reason that it wasn't a stronger recommendation, like a 2A, which is a probable human carcinogen, or what most of us think should be the case, a group 1 known human carcinogen. At that time, there wasn't definitive evidence in animal models that cell phone radiation caused cancer. The NTP study really solved that issue. And that was further documented by the Ramazzini Institute study at even lower concentrations where the same two cancers in rodents were found. So there's a major move to have the International Agency for Research on Cancer to revisit this whole question of the carcinogenicity of radiofrequency radiation. They're a very conservative organization. They probably won't do that immediately, but at some point they will. And the evidence now, I think, is much, much stronger than it was in 2011, I believe, when they issued that report.
I have some requests from the audience, and I would like to know too about the possible environmental effects from increasing our infrastructure and implementing the 5G and the 3G, 4G networks, small cell networks.
Well, it's interesting. I've just had a high school student and a college student, both of whom have studied the effects of radiofrequency radiation on plant growth and seed germination. And this has not gotten a lot of attention by the more traditional academics, but both demonstrated, one, a high school student who basically used an active cell phone versus a cell phone that was turned off, and demonstrated that wheatgrass grew less well if they were exposed to cell phone frequency radiation. And then a student at a Vermont college demonstrated repeated results that have been previously published that germination of seeds was reduced when they were exposed to radiofrequency radiation. There's a body of evidence, whether it's really definitive or not, I wouldn't really say, but implicating the decline of bees from the effect of beehives near cell towers tend not to survive. How much this has to do with the decline of pollinators is a major question. Now, of course, there's also the enormous increase in use of pesticides that is a problem there. But I think that if radiofrequency radiation harms humans, there's almost no question that it's also going to harm wildlife, plants, and other biological organisms.
There's a meta-analysis paper on the effects on plants, and it shows that 90% of the 45 papers that have been analyzed show effects on plants. And just like humans, some plants are more susceptible to this RF radiation than others. In terms of animals, we know that many of the studies we're doing are on animals, and they do die in those studies. So clearly there are effects on animals, but there's a lot of studies on bees and birds and other animals that clearly show effects. In terms of other environmental impacts, if we talk about energy consumption, this is really ironic because they use 5G as a and all the smart grid as a tool to allegedly combat carbon footprint and all other environmental problems we're having, when in fact this is a major contributing factor to all of those problems we are seeing. First of all, a lot of the effects that we're now attributed to climate change, for example, the problem with migrations of birds, are likely also caused by this exposure to radiation. There is a letter from the Department of Interior from 2014 saying that the problem with the migration of birds is because of cell towers. And then they said that the FCC guidelines are 30 years obsolete. In terms of energy consumption, there is a report showing that the increase in the wireless cloud between 2012 to 2015 was equivalent of adding 4.9 million cars to the road. And there's a recent report saying that 5G is likely to increase energy consumption by 170% by 2026, I think. And there are a lot of other reports supporting that. So using 5G or wireless smart technologies to combat energy consumption is kind of like a dumb idea.
So Dr. Hiro, do you have any information to share about the environmental effects? Has that been something you've studied?
Well, the environmental effects are very, very interesting and important because right now an industry is promoting wireless, when in fact we have a beautiful alternative that is entirely hygienic, which is called optical fiber that industry uses for itself, but is reluctant to bring into too many US homes because of the fact that, in fact, it may be a little less profitable. You know that since the breakup of AT&T, you know, the cable companies and the wiring companies have been regulated, whereas wireless is the Far West. You can make as much profit as you like. So we have a superior technology. 5G will bring you to about 10 gigabytes per second. Bell Labs has demonstrated over 2 kilometers over optical fiber of 10 million gigabytes per second. So your only future in telecommunications is in optical fiber and nowhere else. In other words, wireless is just like oil. It will burn itself out because the spectrum is limited, and it will leave a lot of bad traces and taste behind.
I wanted to ask another question from this list. You know, for a lot of the people around here, one of our concerns is that they've already started, it appears they might have already started to put up the 5G structures or the small cell structures outside of the schools. Is there an increased risk that has been shown in children, or is that unclear in the data?
I think we haven't really addressed the potential health effects of 5G. There's pretty good consensus that the millimeter waves don't penetrate the body nearly as deeply as the 3 and 4G. That suggests that probably brain cancer is not going to be as big a problem with pure 5G radiation as it is with 3 and 4. But what about skin cancer? What about cancer of the eyes? What about issues with the ears? What about all of these glands and these nerves that we have in our skin? The nerves penetrate the whole body. So the big problem here with 5G is the lack of very good scientific studies. There are a few studies out there. They're primarily in cells or isolated systems. There have not been any quality studies of human exposure to 5G just because it hasn't been around all that long. But I don't think just because the radiation doesn't penetrate the body as much as 3 and 4G, I don't think that we should just assume then that there's no problem, because this is the essence of the precautionary principle. Let's not roll out a new technology or a new chemical or a new device of any sort, making the assumption that it has no adverse health effects when there's no evidence that it has no adverse health effects.
So
well, I think, can I say something?
Sorry, Jack, just going to quickly just follow up because I want to make sure I understand the answer fully. With the small cell infrastructure that you said, we're going to also see, in addition to the 5G, it's going to be pumping out 3G and 4G at a far higher rate of exposure. So is there a difference really for children versus adults? I mean, do we have any studies that look at the differences in how children might be affected versus adults of that older?
We know that children are much more vulnerable to every environmental exposure. The studies from Sweden, there have been relatively few studies on children, but the studies from Sweden show that a child under the age of 20 that uses a cell phone has a 5-fold greater risk of developing brain cancer than do adults. And furthermore, the latency for developing that brain cancer is shorter. It can be as short as 1 year, whereas for adults, it's 10 or more years. So it's not a surprise that children are more vulnerable. They're growing, they're developing, and younger children, even fetuses, are particularly vulnerable. And, we have this era now where people want to put devices in a baby's crib so that every time they cry, they get warned, or every time they wet their diaper, they get warned. This is just very, very dangerous stuff.
I think there's a few issues with children. First, the brain is smaller, so the radiation penetrates to larger parts of the brain. The skull is thinner, so again, it's easier, it's passing through the skull better. The nervous system is developing, and so they're more susceptible to nervous system effects. And again, their cells multiply, the speed in which the cells multiply is more than double than that of an adult, so there's higher chances of mutations that can lead to cancer. So overall, yes, children are absolutely more sensitive. And Dr. Carpenter mentioned, for example, they're sensitive also as fetus. And there is a study that was done by Yale University professor Hugh Tyler, and he showed that if you expose the mother to this radiation when she's pregnant, there's higher chances that when the fetus or the child is born, that they have higher chances of developing ADHD. And there is a study in humans on 84,000 women. It's a combination of 5 studies that shows that women who are exposed to higher levels of radiation while pregnant, there's higher chance that the children will have behavior and attention problems. So there's numerous problems that we see in children. There's good studies on effect on children. There's 2 studies now from Switzerland, for example, showing that 1 year of cell phone use in teenagers can lead to permanent memory damage. And where the damage is or what kind of damage depends on which side of the brain they use a cell phone, and the damage will be worse if they use it on the right side of the brain. So there's a lot of studies specifically on children. There's studies that will show susceptibility of children while they have more effect. So yes, clearly the answer is yes. And our children are sick.
So we see in rats that if you expose rats, in fact, you rear them, you near a cell phone, there are irreversible changes that can be detected in the structure of the brain. And we also see that these animals will have permanent changes in their behavior. So essentially, by having our children exposed to this radiation, we are probably changing them in a permanent way.
So,
and that's Hugh Tyler's paper also showed. It's creating changes in the brain.
that was Dr. Hugo's. So, if someone feels that, or what are our options? what could we? I mean, I know that cell phones have become so ubiquitous, and now we have this new technology coming. Actually, sorry, I'm going to back up and just ask you a different question. Why are we, you started to hint at this, Daphna, and I think I'd just like to know more. What is the benefit of 5G versus 4G? Like, if there's all these unknowns and we haven't even studied it yet, why the push to start 5G now? And is it just so much better internet, or what's the reason?
So
download
5G,
your movie much faster. That's about the only
well,
benefit.
and that's a story they tell people. So I mean, it's different selling point to different people. So for people, they say, hey, you're going to be able to download your movie instead of in 8 seconds, in 4 seconds. But downloading movies faster, that's not going to pay for an infrastructure which costs us about $200 billion a year. So what does pay for this infrastructure? And the answer is data. So if anything and everything in our environment has an antenna, so they have now ability to learn anything and everything about what we do, how we do, et cetera, et cetera. But this data is going to be collected not for marketing purposes, but mainly for artificial intelligence purposes. And where this is all really going is artificial intelligence and transhumanism, where this is all leading. And that means that we're going to become part humans and part machines. And while for many people it sounds, oh, this is not true, this is very, very real, and it's happening already. And I encourage you to go and check who is Google chief scientist or chief engineer. His name is Dr. Ray Kurzweil. And he wrote a series of books on transhumanism. One of them is Singularity is Near, which means that basically that we're going to be transhuman, and that is going to happen sooner than later. And this is a major issue on which Google is working. Elon Musk recently came out with a new company called Neuralink, which is about implanting chips in your brain that will communicate with your wireless devices. So this is really where all of this is going to lead us. So 5G is not about connecting humans, about connecting things, data, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism, and essentially also surveillance society. So part of the 5G infrastructure, that everything will be connected, is not only those 800,000 more cell towers that they're now installing near our homes, it's also about satellites. So Elon Musk got licensed to launch 12,000 satellites, and he submitted application for 30,000 more to blanket the Earth with wireless. Bill Gates invested in a company that will own 500 satellites. What they're going to do is essentially surveillance. They'll be able to record and video everything that is going to be happening anywhere and everywhere, every second. And you know who are the clients, including the government. So this is really not about downloading movies faster. This is much, much bigger. And that's when we all need to step up and understand that this is really fight for humanity. It's not about, I mean, this is harmful. This is very harmful in terms of our health, but this is going to take us also to places that I know that I don't want to go to. I think that if you ask me what the point of hope, I think this technology is not sustainable because we're adding so much more radiation between those hundreds of thousands of cell towers, satellites, et cetera, et cetera. Humans cannot tolerate this radiation. People are already sick, and we see what's happening to families when they put those small cell antennas near their homes. I don't think it's sustainable. People will just collapse, and they are collapsing, and people start to awaken. And so that's my hope, that more and more people will get educated, understand what this is about, and start to fight back. And this is what we see around the world. And that's actually, in some ways, it's encouraging. I mean, this way, there was a city in Connecticut that voted no for 5G. And we've seen more and more municipalities across the US that are joining. We see countries that are joining. And hopefully, it probably will take time, but as we're going to spread the information and the truth, hopefully more and more people and states and cities will join together and stop this insanity. We have to stop this insanity.
When you started your career working for the Israeli intelligence or the Israeli military?
No, military.
Was 5G being talked about? Was 5G being used, or small cell? Were any of these things that you're talking about now with privacy or surveillance at all implicated in that work, or not really?
We had, in my work in telecommunication, our military headquarters and operations center had communication with the forces on the ground. So there was a lot of wireless going on to connect us.
Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to, I've certainly, most of the people that work in technology do talk about the singularity being near and really being 10 years away from or less from artificial intelligence. And it does sound so kind of fantastical that I think for many of us, we listen to it and we say, well, that's crazy. But when you start to read, pretty much everyone who works in this area agrees it's on the way. Artificial intelligence is on the way, and it's going to dramatically change everything. Is 5G necessary to that? Is that part of the?
That's what 5G is about. This is what it is. Essentially getting the data to get more artificial intelligence data so they know how you act, how you operate, and then they can create all of this robotics that will make us half humans, half machines. And actually, they said that in 10 years, about 40% of our workforce will be gone and be replaced by robots. This is what 5G is about. It's not about faster data. It's not about it's faster internet, and people need to go and read about it. Actually, Robert Kennedy and I wrote an article recently. I can post it exactly about all of those things and where it's going. And people need to wake up and understand what's going on around. This is not about faster speeds. This is just a story.
So, David, do you agree with what Daphna is saying about transhumanism and all of these AI kind of goals of 5G?
Well, I think I agree in general that the whole push for 5G is data, making a lot of money, and the glitter of all that money is so great that nobody is stopping to ask the question of what's the harm. We always need to consider benefits and risks. And I think the political community in general, certainly the technology community, see lots of benefits. But we in the health community see lots of at least possible risks. Things that, while they're not very well documented at present, some are documented, there's some evidence, but it's not well documented. And therefore, to actually go back to your original question, what can we do? Well, I think one thing we can do is oppose the rollout of 5G until, if and when, there's clear demonstration that the risks are not going to be greater than the benefits. Now, that's going to be a tough row to hoe because there's such a push at every level of government. Certainly the federal government, many of the state governments are very anxious to get 5G rolled out because of the economic benefits. But then there was another question about, what can an individual do to reduce their risk to 3G and 4G? Well, there are a number of simple things that one can do. Use a landline rather than a wireless phone. If you're using a wireless phone, use a wired earpiece. Turn your Wi-Fi off at night. Just simple things. If you're talking on your cell phone, you don't have a wired earpiece, hold it a little farther away from your head. Put it on a speakerphone. This exposure is very distance dependent. If you have your cell phone, as I do, on my desk, it's not going to irradiate my body much at all if I have it on a speakerphone there. So now, unfortunately, with 5G and with this rollout, with these many cell towers everywhere, there's not going to be much one can do to avoid exposure except perhaps moving out to the mountains in the country. And even there, you're going to be irradiated by satellite radio frequency radiation. So I think that I'm totally in favor of people trying to use the political process, write to your congressman, write to your senator, write to your governor, and indicate that we don't want something rolled out as tobacco was, as DDT was, as PCBs were, at a time when everybody thought this was God's gift to mankind, and then 30 years later, we find that people are dying because of it. But in the meantime, there are certainly things that individuals can do that can reduce their personal exposure, whether or not we're able to block the rollout of 5G everywhere.
I'd like to say about the rollout of technology that, as David says, we should oppose 5G, but you can get all the services you need, in a very, very economical way, if only industry change its attitude, in the sense that I can easily reduce your exposure in the present system by a factor of 100 by simple modifications in hardware and in software. These things are not being done because industry is deliberately blinding itself to the truth.
I want to address a same question coming again and again. So people ask, how can the satellite radiate to the Earth if those frequencies don't travel well? Those frequencies can travel pretty well if there's nothing that blocks them. So since there will be nothing between the satellites and our ground that will block those frequencies, they can get to the Earth. There's a study that was done in Virginia by NYU. They showed that a millimeter wave can travel 6.7 miles without interruption, while in New York City, it was traveling only about 200 meters. So it really depends if there's things in the environment that interfere with the transmission. So there's no problem with satellites. But people need to know about the satellites also, that our devices are not going to communicate directly with those satellites. Those satellites will radiate all of us, and every corner will be radiated by them. But we will have also, they plan, Elon Musk got an approval from the FCC to deploy 1 million antennas. So our devices are going to communicate with antennas on the ground, and the antennas on the ground will communicate with the satellites. So in addition to the radiation from the satellites, we're going to have antennas on the ground anywhere and everywhere. And actually the FCC, for that purpose, is about to pass a rule, which is, or expand a rule, which is called the Orchard Rule, which will allow cell tower on people's homes. So people can contract with the wireless industry to put a cell tower in their home. They would not even need a permit for that. And actually the Children's Health Defense has been conducting a big campaign against it. And we actually last week submitted our ex parte letter to the FCC, which is a legal letter.
I want to hear about that, but I just want to make sure we have
Yeah.
time to address the rollout that is happening here in Ithaca. We haven't gotten to the point where we're talking about on homes, but just quickly, is it something that would be rolled out everywhere if the FCC allows this to be on homes?
It's not a matter of a rollout. There's no process of rollout. People will just going to contract independently with the industry and to put those antennas on their home. And there's
Okay.
nothing
So
that we'll be able to do about it.
For another day that we also need to know about. But so right now we have this situation where Verizon wants to have a contract with our city, the city of Ithaca, to install, do a massive kind of increase in the small cell towers in the right of ways. What are the legal options that we have? I have two parts of that question, Daphne, if you don't mind. One is if our city government does not get on board and support a pause, do we have any legal options as constituents to fight it? And two, if our city government were to listen to our concerns and say, if this is worth a pause, let's learn a little bit more, make sure it's safe before rapidly expanding this kind of radiation, what could we do at this point? I know that the FCC has very oppressive rules about cities saying no.
Well, it's complex to be answering it in such a way, but there's a lot that can be done. First of all, the more the community will get involved and put pressure on the municipality, the better chances you're going to have to not to block it, but to limit it. You cannot block the installation of 5G according to the FCC regulation, but you can definitely limit it. And there's a lot of legal ways in which you can limit the installation of 5G within cities and municipalities. And it really depends on the city's intentions and determination to do it. And there are a lot of legal ways to do it. There's, for example, most importantly, there is no insurance for industry for health effects on this technology. Most cities overlook that, do not demand proper insurance from the wireless industry. And if they demand it, that's a really beautiful way to stop it. They cannot get insurance for the health effects. And so there's a lot of technical ways to limit.
If our city government were to pass a resolution that said that, okay, we'll sign the contract, but you need to have insurance for the health effects, they could do that?
They can basically set rules and directions, what kind of insurance they require from the provider. There's nothing that stops you from requiring certain insurance. If anything, you have a duty to do this and to protect the interests of the residents of the city. So I actually, we did a really excellent program recently. It's called Ask the Lawyers. It was sponsored by 5G Free California. It's available online. It's actually on We Are the Evidence website and on 5G Free California. You can access it. A lot of really good questions and answers. There were 4 attorneys on the call. There is a good attorney in California. His name is Andrew Campanelli. He's been helping a lot of municipalities. Also, Ariel Strauss, Mark Pollock, Scott McCullough, who is the attorney we're working on. Okay, so there's a lot of attorneys, more and more attorneys are getting involved with this topic, and there are a lot that municipalities can do. They don't want to do it, they don't want to deal with it. They said their hands are tied behind the back. They're not. If they really want to take action and limit the installation, they can do quite a lot. And if anything, they have the obligation to do it. And how much they will do depends on the residents. So yeah, there's a lot you can do.
I wanted to ask, sorry, I'm trying to look at the chat and make sure that
Yeah, I'll post the links. I'm just going to post the link for that Ask the Lawyer conversation. I'm going to do it now.
Does anybody else, we only have a few more minutes now. Does anybody have any more of the health or environmental questions that if you want to post now, why don't you go ahead and I will.
I think one advice, if I may tell people, so I think one of the most important thing to do is to get a meter, a radio frequency meter, because this radiation is invisible. Most people cannot, we don't see it, we don't smell it. Some people can hear it or affect it, but for most people it's invisible. And it's really important to make the invisible visible so people can start and understand the environment, what emits radiation, how much radiation it is. And so that's my recommendation to people. This is a meter that I have. This is a simple meter. It's $170. You can buy it in a lot of places. I recommend buying it from Activist, not from Amazon, because Amazon is actually promoting this technology. And this makes things real for people and helps you understand your environment. I suggest people read and reduce their exposure. We expose to so much radiation we cannot control. The only thing you really can control to some extent is the radiation in your home, and have no doubt that anyone and everyone is affected every second we're being exposed. So take care, because there are no warning sign. You can be fine. I was fine with this technology. I had 2 cell phone, Wi-Fi nonstop. Everything was fine. 1 second, no warning sign. I couldn't tolerate it anymore. And it happens to more and more people. So not a moment too soon to be careful with this.
Dr. Carpenter, do you have closing thoughts about this topic?
Well, I'm a public health physician. Public health is trying to reduce human disease from a variety of things, from coronaviruses, from ionizing radiation, from non-ionizing radiation, from chemicals. And I think my basic philosophy is that we need to apply the precautionary principle. We need not to roll out things, even when we don't know how dangerous they are. When we have good evidence that they are dangerous, we need to step back and take a deep breath and study that technology so that we know what the risks are and not get just carried away by potential benefits. The benefits are likely to be primarily to certain industries and people, but we need to protect human health.
Thank you. And Dr. Hiro.
Oh, yes, I have a few comments. In 1776, Adam Smith, who is the priest of capitalism, gave you a warning. He said essentially, never let the salesman make the rules. This is exactly what you did in the United States. And he essentially said, in the wealth of nations, these people will do whatever it takes to make a penny, even if it is over your body. And as far as measuring the field, I would recommend the GQ EMF 390. This is a new meter made in the US. It's a very, very high performance unit for the price. You'll find that it can do automated recordings. You can connect it to your computer. It's a very nice unit.
And Dr. Hiro, just to follow up, how do they do things in Canada? How is it different in Canada in terms of regulation?
Well, essentially, Canada is a bit of a pale reflection of the United States. We don't have something as oppressive as Section 704 of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, but we have the equivalent in that here as well, they're telling us that Industry Canada can decide where towers are implanted. But in practice, many cities have opposed this in the way more or less that Daphna describes. And if a community really wants to oppose it, they can.
And around the world, is the regulation stricter? Are there things that we could be doing to make?
Well, you know that in the USSR, originally their standards were 1,000 times lower than those in the West. And their standards were not based on heat. They were based on neurological impacts. And with the perspective of time, we have to admit that the Soviets were entirely right, sadly to say.
And in Sweden and other countries have put a moratorium as well, right?
Well, in Italy, it's the most active place where more than 100 municipalities have put a hold on 5G because they have had the Radio Vatican experience where, the Vatican wanted to spread its word of Catholicism around the world. So they had these huge antennas And in the cities neighboring to these antennas, they had rates of leukemia that were 7 times higher than the general population. So there, they have long-standing court cases. Why do we have to go through a process like this everywhere?
Dr. Hiro, can you just tell us again, what was the meter you recommended?
It's GQ EMF 390. I think it will run you about $150. It can record low frequencies. It can record high frequencies to 10 gigahertz. And if you leave it on your desk, it will keep a complete record every second for 24 hours. And it comes with software that allows you to download this into your computer.
Great. And just quickly, Dr. Carpenter and Dr. Hiro, maybe you have the answer, and also Attorney Tachover. If people are looking to also see the perspective of scientists that are not funded by industry in any way, but have less concerns about this issue, who would you recommend as some independent quality scientists that they could check out, or who is working in this area that doesn't have concerns, that is not industry funded?
Well, I think I would refer people to the authors of the Bioinitiative report. You know, it's very difficult. Everybody has a conflict of interest at one level or another. And I don't mean to minimize that. The financial conflicts of interest are the most dangerous. And the Bioinitiative report has been criticized by a lot of people because they view it as an advocacy document. But that's because we selected people that didn't have financial conflicts of interest that could be objective in their review of the literature. I would be happy if individuals want to email me to give advice on other people. But I think the Bioinitiative report authors would be a good place to start.
Wonderful. And yeah, just in closing, you know, there is this this growing trend. This happened with fracking as well. I remember Dr. Steingraber was frequently you know, she did become a climate activist, but they were saying it was a conflict of interest with her science. But the reason that she became an activist was because her science was so clearly showing a danger that she had to get involved. So this idea that you know, scientists who discover these problems and then speak out about it are somehow conflicted is an interesting one. We don't have time to explore now, but I just really want to thank you all for coming, for sharing all of your time and knowledge. I know that you all are very busy people, and it's so great to come help us explore this issue, and we can keep doing that, and hopefully we can reach out to you with questions sometimes. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
It was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.